The morning came in slow and gray over Windsor, the kind of morning that feels like it is still deciding what it wants to be. Mist sat low across the lawns, and the trees at the far end of the grounds stood like dark sentinels in the fog, barely visible, barely real. The gravel paths that cut through the gardens were still damp from the night before, and every now and then, a bird called out from somewhere in the hedgerows, a single sharp note that echoed and then disappeared into the quiet. James Alderton had been standing at his post for just under 2 hours. He was 28 years old, a Royal Guard of 6 years' service, and he had learned long ago that the job was mostly this: waiting. Standing straight. Watching without appearing to watch. Breathing without appearing to breathe too much. The uniform was heavy and formal, and the cold of an early English morning had a way of working itself through the layers no matter how well you dressed underneath. But he had stopped noticing the cold somewhere around year 3. Now it was just weather. Just part of the morning. His post that day was along the eastern corridor of the palace grounds, a stretch of path that connected the private garden entrance to a small courtyard that the senior members of the family sometimes used when they wanted to walk without being seen by the larger household. It was a quiet assignment, usually uneventful. Most mornings he stood here and saw nothing but a groundskeeper or two and the occasional kitchen assistant cutting through with a tray. It was the kind of post younger guards complained about. James had come to prefer it. He had learned, in 6 years, that the quiet posts were where you actually saw things. The official schedule that morning had noted a working breakfast in the East Wing and a series of afternoon engagements for several members of the family. Nothing about the private garden. Nothing about the courtyard. That was normal enough. Not every movement was scheduled, and the family had learned over generations how to move through their own home without needing to announce themselves at every turn. James had been briefed on the usual protocols. Stay visible enough to be reassuring. Stay invisible enough not to intrude. He was good at both. At 9:20, he heard footsteps on the gravel path approaching from the direction of the private entrance. He recognized the walk before he saw the face. Catherine, Princess of Wales, walked with a particular kind of deliberateness that was not quite formal and not quite casual. It was something in between a posture that said she was always aware she might be seen, always aware of what that meant, but had made peace with it somewhere along the way. She moved like a woman who had practiced being calm for so long that it had become genuinely true. She was dressed simply that morning, dark coat, hair pulled back, no jewelry that James could see from his position. No aide. No secretary. No protection officer walking 3 steps behind. She had come alone. That in itself was not unusual for the private garden. The inner grounds were secure. But James noticed it. He noticed everything, out of habit, out of training, and because after 6 years in this job you understood that the small details were often the ones that mattered later. Catherine walked to the low stone bench at the near end of the courtyard and sat down. She did not look at her phone. She did not take out anything to read. She simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, and looked out at the garden. The mist was still moving slowly across the far hedge. A pigeon landed on the gravel a few meters away, considered her, and walked off. She watched it go. James stood at his post and watched, without watching. There was something in the way she sat that was different from the way she appeared in photographs or at public engagements. In those settings she was warm and engaged and present in the way that all of them in the family had learned to be, turned toward people, smiling with real energy, remembering names, asking the right questions. She was very good at it. Everyone said so. James had seen her work a room at a formal reception once, years ago, when he had been posted to the interior, and he had been struck by it, the way she could move from one conversation to the next without losing any warmth, like she had infinite reserves of it. But, sitting alone on the bench that morning, she was something else. She was not performing anything. She was just a woman sitting in a garden on a cold morning, and, whatever she was thinking about it very quietly and very much to herself. There was no tiredness in her face, exactly. More like the look of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has learned how to carry it so that it does not show, and, in this particular moment, in this particular empty courtyard, has allowed themselves to put it down for a few minutes. James had seen that look before. Not on her. On his mother, years ago, in the kitchen after his father had left. On his older sister the week before her wedding, sitting outside on the back step, not crying, just sitting. It was the look of someone who was completely fine and, also something other than fine, and, had decided, for now, that both things could be true at once. He did not think about it further. It was not his business to think about it further. He stood at his post and, the mist moved and, the pigeon came back and, walked off again and, the morning continued at its own slow pace. He heard the second set of footsteps approximately 12 minutes later. These were different. Crisper. More purposeful. The stride of someone who had somewhere to be but, was not rushing, or rather, someone for whom hurrying would be beneath consideration. James had been around Princess and enough times to recognize that particular quality in her movement. She was in her 70s now, and she walked like a woman who had walked through every kind of difficult situation this country had to offer and had found all of them manageable. There was a confidence in it that was not arrogance. Arrogance was brittle, and Princessin was anything but brittle. It was more like the confidence of someone who has simply been tested enough times to have stopped worrying about the test. She came through the garden gate and into the courtyard wearing a dark jacket and sensible shoes, and she was carrying 2 cups. Ceramic, by the look of them. Palace cups, not takeaway. She had brought them from somewhere inside. James kept his eyes forward and adjusted nothing. Princessin saw Catherine on the bench and did not change pace, did not pause, did not make any of the small adjustments in body language that most people make when they encounter someone unexpectedly. She simply walked toward her as though she had known exactly where she was going all along. Perhaps she had. Catherine looked up when she heard the footsteps. Something moved across her face, not surprise, not quite. More like recognition mixed with something softer. Something that might have been relief, if relief could be quiet enough not to announce itself. Princessin reached the bench and held out one of the cups. "You look like you could use this," she said. No preamble. No greeting. Just that. Catherine took the cup with both hands and said something in return that James could not hear from his distance. Her voice was low and the morning was too quiet in the way that open spaces can be quiet, sound traveling up instead of across. But whatever she said made Princessin make a small sound, almost a laugh, the kind that comes out before you decide whether to let it. Princessin sat down on the bench beside her. Not at a polite distance. Beside her. The way you sit beside someone you are not performing comfort for. The way you sit when you are actually just there. James had been a royal guard for 6 years. He had stood at posts outside private rooms, outside hospital wards, outside the closed doors of meetings that the public never heard about and never would. He had learned very thoroughly how to be present without being present, how to observe without making observation feel like surveillance. He had seen members of the family in moments that were not for public consumption, moments of frustration, of grief, of laughter that was not for cameras, of the particular tiredness that came from living your entire life in view of strangers. He had never felt like he was intruding on any of it. That morning, standing at his post in the damp courtyard as the mist continued to lift slowly from the hedgerows, watching 2 women sit together on a stone bench with their cups of tea and their quiet and the easy absence of conversation, he felt it less than ever. Whatever this was, it was theirs. He turned his eyes back to the garden path. Kept his posture. Breathed slowly. The pigeon returned one more time and, then, left for good. The morning continued. And said something else, longer this time, and Catherine nodded in the way that people nod when they are not just agreeing but genuinely receiving something, taking it in, letting it settle. James had spent 6 years learning to read rooms and spaces and the mood of a corridor without making eye contact with anyone in it, and he could feel, even from his distance, that the thing happening on that bench was not small. It was not dramatic. There was no tears he could see, no raised voices, no visible distress. It was the opposite of dramatic. 2 women, a cup of tea each, a garden coming slowly back to itself in the morning light. And, yet, the weight of it was real. He could not have explained to anyone why he was certain of that. But he was. Princessin had not come to the garden by accident. Of that he was also certain. The cups were not an afterthought. She had known where Catherine would be, or had found out, or had simply understood, in the way that certain people understand certain things about certain people without needing to be told, that this was a morning that called for company of a very specific kind. Not the company of friends exactly, though perhaps that too. The company of someone who had been through the fire of this particular life. Who knew what it cost. Who did not need it explained to them and would not try to explain it back. James watched the path ahead of him. The mist finished lifting. The garden, gray and green and wet and real, settled into the morning. On the bench, neither woman moved for a long time. James Alderton had a habit, developed over years of long and mostly silent posts, of noticing things about people that they did not know they were showing. It was not a talent exactly, more of a consequence. When you stood still long enough, when you made yourself invisible enough, the world around you forgot to guard itself. And, then, the real things came through. He had seen a senior equerry lose composure completely over a misplaced document and, then, recover it so fast that anyone walking in 10 seconds later would have seen nothing. He had watched a young footman cry silently in a corridor during a state funeral, shoulders perfectly still, face angled away from the cameras, tears coming down anyway. He had stood outside a room where a very serious conversation was happening between people whose public faces never changed, and felt the temperature of the corridor shift, not the actual temperature, but the one that had nothing to do with heating systems. He had a sense for the weight of rooms. And of mornings. That morning in the courtyard, the weight was not heavy in a bad way. It was heavy in the way that something important is heavy. The way a good book is heavier than a light one. The way a real conversation leaves more behind in the air than a polite one. Princess Anne had sat down beside Catherine on the bench approximately 17 minutes ago. James had not counted deliberately. He had simply kept track, the way he always kept track, a background function that ran without requiring any particular attention. 17 minutes. Neither of them had stood up. Neither of them had checked a phone. Neither had gestured toward the inside of the building in the way people gesture when they are aware of time and appointments and the machinery of a scheduled day grinding forward without them. They were still. The garden was beginning to properly wake around them. A groundskeeper had appeared on the far end of the lawn, moving slowly with a rake, dealing with something in the hedgerow. He had seen the two women on the bench and made the professional and practiced adjustment that all of the household staff made when they encountered family in an unscheduled moment, a small repositioning of direction, nothing sharp enough to be obvious, just a gradual arc that took him further away rather than closer. He had been doing this job long enough to understand the geometry of privacy. James understood it too. The cups were still in their hands. Catherine's with both, as it had been since she received it. Anne's with one, her right, her elbow resting on her knee in a posture that was not elegant in the formal sense but had a comfort to it, an ease, the posture of someone in their own home, which she had been for more than 70 years. They were talking more now, or rather, Anne was talking more. Catherine was listening. Not the polite listening of a public engagement, where you tilt your head and maintain eye contact and make all the right noises in all the right places. The other kind. The kind where you are actually taking the words apart as they arrive and turning them over and looking at what is underneath them. James could see it in the set of her shoulders, which had changed since he had first noticed her on the bench. Earlier they had been carried with that practiced composure he had observed, the nothing is wrong posture that takes years to perfect. Now they were lower. Not collapsed. Just set down. The difference between holding something and resting it. He wondered, not for the first time and not for the last, what it was like to be her. Not in the way that tabloids wondered. Not in the way that the public wondering was usually about the clothes and the children and the marriage and all the visible surfaces of a life that had become, through no particular design of her own, everyone's business. He wondered in the specific and practical way that he wondered about most people he observed, what it actually cost, on a daily and weekly and yearly basis, to live inside the particular set of demands that life had placed on you. And to live inside them with the level of grace that she appeared to manage, most days, from what he could observe. 6 years of observation. He had seen her at formal dinners and garden parties and charity visits and hospital openings and the long parade of public engagements that filled a working royal's calendar from January to December. He had seen her when the events ran long and the energy it took to be on genuinely on, not just present but radiating something that people in a room could feel must have been enormous. He had seen her, once, standing in a corridor between two rooms of people she was about to greet, taking a single breath, a real one, and then walking in. That one breath. He had thought about it often. Because that was the thing that most people watching from the outside never understood, or rarely understood, the sustained nature of it. Not the big moments. The sustained nature of it. The day after day after day of being exactly what the institution required, of being warm when you were tired, being calm when things were difficult, being present for other people's crises and other people's sorrows and other people's joy and managing all of it without being allowed, publicly, to have your own in the same way. He was not naive about the privilege of the life. The palaces and the staff and the extraordinary access and the material reality of it were real, and he was not the type to pretend that didn't matter. It mattered. But he had also stood close enough, for long enough, to know that the trade was a genuine one. That you gave up something real. That the something real, given up daily over years, accumulated. That was what he saw on Catherine's face that morning, before Anne arrived. The accumulation of it. Anne was still talking. She had shifted slightly on the bench, angled a few degrees toward Catherine, not quite facing her but no longer looking away. James could see the profile of her face and there was something in it, a clarity, a directness, the look of someone saying a thing because it needs to be said, not because it is easy or comfortable or expected. And had never been famous for comfortable. She was famous for the opposite. For saying the thing that others wrapped in 17 layers of polite packaging, unwrapped, straight, here it is. Some people found that difficult. Others found it the most relieving thing in the world. From what James could read of Catherine's posture, it appeared to be the latter. He watched her absorb whatever Anne was saying, not passively, but actively, the way you absorb something that is reaching somewhere in you that has not been reached recently. Her head moved in a small nod, once, twice. Her hands shifted around the cup. She looked out at the garden for a moment, then, back at Anne. Then, she spoke. James still could not hear the words. He was not trying to. He had positioned himself, out of habit and professionalism, at a distance and angle that meant voices carried away from him unless they were raised. He was getting nothing but the shape of the exchange, the rhythm of it, the duration of the turns, the texture of the pauses. The pauses were what told him most. Between people who are performing comfort or performing connection, the pauses are managed. They are filled with a laugh, with a platitude, with a question that redirects. Between people who are actually in it together, the pauses are left alone. They sit there and they are not uncomfortable and they do not need to be fixed. They are just part of the thing. The pauses on that bench were left alone. That told him more than the words would have. He had been standing at this post for 2 hours and 40 minutes. His relief would come in 20 minutes. He thought about this in the background, the mechanical fact of the rotation, and then put it aside and returned to the garden. The groundskeeper had moved further along the hedgerow and was now nearly out of sight. The mist was fully gone. The morning had settled into itself, one of those English winter mornings that turns out to be better than it first promised, the sky thinning and a pale wash of cold light beginning to move across the lawn. Princess Anne said something that made Catherine laugh. Not a polite laugh. Not the public laugh that was warm and generous and performed and still perfectly real. He had seen that laugh many times, knew the shape of it. This was smaller. More involuntary. The kind that comes out before the person decides to let it, and then, once it is out, something in the face releases a small but genuine release, like a room after a window has been opened. And looked at her when she laughed. Looked at her with an expression James did not have an immediate word for. He was good with people, had always been observant, had 6 years of training in reading the unspoken language of rooms and bodies and silences. But the expression on Princess Anne's face in that moment was one he did not often see in this building, or in many buildings. It was the expression of someone watching someone they genuinely care for come back up for air. Not rescue. Not triumph. Just the quiet satisfaction of having been exactly what someone needed and having known it and having done it without making anything of it. Without requiring anything from it in return. He turned his eyes back to the path. His hands remained at his sides. 20 minutes to his relief. He breathed steadily into the cold morning air and stood at his post and kept his silence and let the garden be what it was. The conversation on the bench continued. Softer now. The kind of conversation that is finished with its important work and is moving into the simpler territory that comes after the ordinary things, the small things, the things that mean nothing in themselves but mean everything is a sign that the weight has shifted, that the morning has passed through whatever it needed to pass through and is now on the other side. James had been in enough important rooms and corridors and posts to know that the moments that mattered were rarely the ones that announced themselves. They were rarely the signed documents or the formal speeches or the photographed exchanges. They were far more often this: a bench in a garden, 2 cups of tea, the mist lifting, the morning going on. He kept watching the path. The pale winter light moved across the lawn. Neither woman moved from the bench when James Alderton's relief arrived. A younger guard named Henderson, 2 years in, still at the stage where he stood a fraction too rigid. The handover was wordless, as it always was. A nod. A brief shift in position. James stepped back from the post and Henderson stepped into it, and the post continued without interruption, which was the whole point. James did not look back at the bench as he walked away. He walked the long way back through the east wing, the internal route, past the portraits and the long corridor that always smelled faintly of beeswax and something else he had never identified and had stopped trying to. Some compound of the building itself, of age and stone and the particular atmosphere of a place that had held this much history inside it for this long. He had walked this corridor so many times that he no longer saw it in the way you see things you encounter for the first time. He saw it the way you see things that have become part of your daily reality, present, familiar, real in the way that only the deeply familiar is real. He stopped in the small antechamber where guards on rotation went between posts. There was a kettle. Someone had left biscuits on a plate, the plain digestive kind, and he took 2 without thinking about it and stood by the narrow window that looked out over a different section of the grounds, the formal side, where visitors arrived, where the world that the palace showed to outsiders began. He thought about the bench. Not about the content of what had been said, that was not his to think about, and he was practiced enough at the job that he did not find himself inventing what he could not hear. What he thought about was the structure of it. The shape. What it had been. He had been in this building long enough to understand something that took most people years to understand about institutions like this one, which was that they were not monolithic. From the outside they appeared that way, unified, coherent, presenting a single surface to the world. But inside they were made of people, and people did not unify completely, and the relationships between those people were as complicated and layered and human as the relationships anywhere else. There were loyalties and tensions and long histories and things that had been said and things that had not been said and the accumulated weight of decades of proximity and difference and shared purpose and separate personalities. Princess Anne and Catherine had not always been assumed, from the outside, to be particularly close. The press occasionally played at the idea of distance, generational, temperamental, the classic narrative of the institution's old guard and its newer arrivals viewing each other with some wariness. James had read enough of that coverage, accidentally, over the years. It was unavoidable in a country that cared about the family the way this country did to know the shape of that narrative. What he had seen on the bench that morning was not that narrative. What he had seen was something older and simpler and more real. The older woman had known where to find the younger one on a difficult morning and had gone there with something warm in her hands and had sat down without ceremony and had said the thing and let the silence exist and waited for the laugh and watched for the release of it and had done all of this as though it were perfectly ordinary, because for her it was. Because she was someone who understood, from 7 decades of living inside the specific pressures of this life, what the specific pressures cost, and who acted on that understanding not with speeches or formal gestures but with cups of tea and direct sentences and the willingness to sit still for as long as it took. James bit into his second biscuit and looked out at the formal grounds. A car was arriving at the distant gate. Visitors, or officials, or someone on the morning schedule. The world of appointments and schedules and the visible business of the institution was moving forward as it always did, relentless and organized and indifferent to the private moments happening inside its walls. He thought about the word grace. He used it in his own head cautiously. It was the kind of word that got used too much and too loosely when people talked about royalty, used as a synonym for elegance or beauty or the simple fact of carrying themselves well in formal settings. He had stopped being impressed by that kind of grace years ago. It was a skill like any other, learnable, practicable, and many people who had it were nothing in particular underneath. What he had seen that morning was something different. What Princess Anne had done, not dramatically, not with any visible effort, not in any way that would read as remarkable if it were described without context, was the application of a kind of grace that came from genuinely having been through something and having come out with understanding rather than simply scars. She had not offered sympathy in the way that sympathy was usually offered, which was to say with the implicit suggestion that the person receiving it was somewhat diminished by their need for it. She had offered it differently. In the way that said, "I know this because I lived it. You are not weak for finding it hard. Here is what I have found useful." There was no condescension in it. None of the subtle weight that can come with the comfort of elders who have experienced more, the weight of "I have been through worse or at least I survived it." There was none of that. There was just someone who had carried the particular burden of this life for a very long time, sitting down beside someone who was still in the middle of carrying it, and being useful in the most specific and practical way she knew how. James finished his biscuit. He looked at the plate and decided against a third. He had been in this building for 6 years. He had 3 more on his current contract and was fairly sure he would renew after that, though he had not said so to anyone officially. The job had got into him in ways he had not expected when he started. He had expected the pomp and the formality and the weight of the institution. He had not expected the intimacy of it, the particular intimacy of proximity, of being trusted with the private face of things, of being given, repeatedly, access to the moments that nobody else saw. He did not know what to do with that intimacy exactly. He had never told anyone outside the job about the things he saw, and not because he was contractually obligated not to, though he was, but because they did not translate. Because the thing that made those moments significant was precisely the context they existed in, and that context was too large and too specific to compress into a story at a dinner table. He had tried once, years ago, early in the job, to explain to a friend what the work was actually like, and had watched his friend's eyes glaze over somewhere around the 3rd or 4th corridor and given up. It was not a job you could explain. You could only do it. The antechamber kettle clicked off. He poured a cup and wrapped his hands around it and stood there for a moment, warming them. He thought about Catherine on the bench before Anne arrived. That particular stillness. That particular quality of someone who has put their public face to one side for a few minutes, just here, just in this garden, just for now. He thought about the managed poise that woman brought to every public appearance, every engagement, every interaction with strangers, which was most of her interactions, because the nature of the job was that you were almost always surrounded by people who were strangers to you even when you had met them before, because the relationship was never equal, never reciprocal, never just 2 people having a conversation about what was actually in their heads. It was always mediated. Always performed. Always for something. And he thought about how rarely, inside all of that, there was an opportunity for the thing that everyone needed, the thing that everyone needed regardless of circumstance or position or postcode, which was to sit with someone who actually knew you and be known. And had come that morning because she actually knew her. Not the public her. The other one. The one on the bench. That mattered. It mattered in a way that had nothing to do with protocol or hierarchy or the internal politics of this building or any of the things that the press and the public and the documentarians spent their time trying to decode about this family. It mattered in the oldest and simplest of ways, which was that loneliness was real and being seen was real and someone who has the knowledge and the will and the occasion to cut through the loneliness and do the seeing is a rare and serious thing. Princess Anne was a rare and serious thing. James had known this, professionally, for years. He had respected it in the abstract, factual, serviceable way he respected all the senior members of the family, with a clear-eyed understanding of who they were and what they represented and what the job required of both him and them. But that morning in the courtyard had shifted it from abstract to concrete. He had seen it happen. He had been close enough to understand what was happening even from a distance, without words, and the understanding had stayed with him. He drank his tea. Outside, the car had reached the entrance and the formal machinery of the morning was in full effect, figures moving, doors opening, the choreographed welcome that the building did with such expertise that it looked effortless, which was of course the point. Inside, in a small antechamber with a kettle and a plate of digestives, a royal guard of 6 years' service stood by a narrow window and thought, not for the first time, that the life of this building was two buildings, the one that faced outward, and the one that faced in. He had been stationed in both. He knew which one was more interesting. He rinsed his cup. He put it back on the shelf where it lived. He went back to work. 3 days after the morning in the courtyard, James Alderton was posted to the interior corridor outside the drawing room where a series of meetings was taking place. It was a long, carpeted hall with portraits on the walls and a particular quality of silence that made every footstep sound considered. He had stood in this corridor many times. He stood in it now with his hands at his sides and his eyes forward and his mind in the particular state of open blankness that long interior posts required, not switched off, never switched off, but set to a kind of patient readiness that asked nothing of itself but to be available. He was thinking, in the background of that readiness, about something his mother had told him when he was very young. He could not have been more than 8 or 9. They had been at a family gathering of some sort, his mother's side, and an elderly aunt of hers had been sitting in a corner of the room, not really part of any conversation, just watching. And he had said something to his mother, something like, "Why doesn't she talk to anyone, is she lonely?" And his mother had said, "No love, she is watching." And, when he had asked what the difference was, his mother had looked at him with the slight exasperation of someone explaining something they consider obvious but are trying to be patient about, and said, "Watching is how some people love." He had been 8. He had not understood it then. He understood it now. He thought about it because of what he had seen on the bench, and because of what he had been doing on the bench, the watching, and because he had spent 3 days turning it over without quite being able to name what it was that had struck him so deeply about an entirely unremarkable scene. 2 women. A garden. Tea. 25-30 minutes. Nothing that would fill a newspaper column or a documentary chapter or even a particularly interesting anecdote at a dinner party. Nothing that would register as significant in any official account of the day. And, yet, he kept returning to it. The way you return to a piece of music that you cannot get out of your head, not because it is showy or complicated but because it has touched something simple and real. The way you return to a line in a book that is not dramatic but is true in a way that keeps mattering. What he kept returning to, specifically, was the moment and had sat down. Not what came after. The moment itself. The choice of it. The manner of it, not the grand gesture, not the formal act of support that would later be recorded and remembered and, perhaps photographed at some distant point when the story became public enough to be a story. Just a woman who had been through this longer, sitting down beside a woman who was still in it. Without being asked. Without making anything of it. With tea. He had sat with that image for 3 days and he had come to understand that what made it powerful was precisely what was absent from it. There was no performance. There was no calculus of public appearance or family optics or any of the 17 other things that always ran in the background of this building, running perpetually, impossible to fully escape. There was no gesture toward how this would look. There was only the actual doing of it, stripped of everything else, reduced to its simplest form. Here is someone who needs something. I have the something. I am going to go and give it to her. That simplicity, inside this building, was not common. It was not that the people who lived and worked here were not capable of it. They were. But the institution had its weight, and the weight pressed on everything, and the longer you were inside it the more the weight accumulated, the more every action became layered with implication and precedent and meaning that extended outward in every direction, and the harder it became to do anything in its simplest form. The harder it became to just do the thing. Princess Anne had done the thing. That was what stayed with him. The drawing room door opened and a figure emerged, one of the senior household staff, and walked briskly past him down the corridor without looking at him, which was standard and fine. James returned his attention to the present. Post. Corridor. The faint sound of voices still coming from behind the closed door. He thought about longevity. Not in any grand or philosophical sense, but in the particular and practical sense of what it meant to have been inside an institution for a very long time. Princess Anne had been inside this institution for all of her life. She had been born into it, raised inside it, shaped by it in ways that were deep and permanent and not all of them chosen. She had also pushed back against it, consistently, throughout her entire public life, had been more outspoken, more direct, less willing to perform the decorative functions of royalty and more interested in the serious ones, less concerned with how she appeared and more concerned with whether she was being useful. She had a reputation, earned and sustained over decades, for not suffering fools and not wasting time and not pretending that things were fine when they were not. She also had a reputation quieter, less often written about, for being remarkably loyal to the people she cared about. For showing up. For knowing when to show up and how and in what form. What James had witnessed on that bench was the product of all of that, of all those decades of being inside this life and paying attention to it and learning what it asked of people and what it cost them and what, specifically, helped. She had not arrived with the wrong things. She had not arrived with advice about managing the press or thoughts on upcoming engagements or the gentle institutional pressure to be seen and visible and strong. She had not arrived with any of the things that the building's machinery would have offered. She had arrived with tea and directness and silence and the willingness to laugh at something small, and those were the right things, and she had known they were the right things, and she had brought them. That knowing was its own kind of gift. Perhaps the most important kind. James had been thinking about his own 6 years in the job and what he had learned in them, and the answer he kept arriving at was that the most important thing he had learned, the thing that most changed how he moved through the work, was how to tell the difference between the significant and the merely visible. How to understand that the things that mattered in this building were very often not the things that looked like they mattered from the outside, and that the inverse was also true. The things that looked unremarkable from the outside were sometimes the things that held the most weight. The bench. The garden. The tea. He thought about Catherine walking into that garden alone that morning. He thought about the particular discipline it must take to carry what she carried and to carry it with the consistency that she did, and to do that carrying in public, where the watching never stopped, where every expression was recorded and interpreted and reinterpreted and made into a story about something. He thought about how rarely, in a life like that, you found yourself in a place where the watching had gone away. Where you could just sit. And he thought about how it had not, in the end, been the aloneness that had helped. It had been the company. Not the company of crowds, which was abundant and constant and, in some ways, the most isolated kind of company there was. The company of one person who sat down beside you without drama and handed you something warm and said the true thing and waited. He had been young enough, when he started this job, to think that his role was essentially passive. Stand here. Be present. Do not interfere. Let the life of the building move around you. He had thought of himself as furniture with better posture, necessary, functional, invisible. He did not think of it that way anymore. He thought of it as witnessing. As being the kind of presence that made certain things possible, not because he did anything, not because he acted, but because the knowledge that someone steady was in the corridor, someone reliable, someone who had agreed to hold the space and ask nothing of it, made the space itself safer. Made it possible for the real things to happen inside it. He was not arrogant enough to think he was important to what had happened in the garden. He was not fool enough to think he had been irrelevant either. He had been there. He had held the post. He had kept his silence. He had turned his eyes to the path and let the moment be what it was, and, in doing so, had been, in the smallest possible way, part of the structure that allowed it. That felt like enough. It felt, if he was honest, like exactly enough. The voices behind the drawing room door paused and then resumed and then paused again. A clock somewhere further down the corridor marked the half hour. The carpet was the deep red kind that absorbed sound without completely eliminating it, and the corridor had the particular quality of held breath that long formal interiors often had, the sense that the walls themselves had been present for things that mattered and had developed a kind of gravity from the accumulated weight of it. He stood at his post. He thought about his mother and what she had said about watching being how some people love. He thought about a woman in her 70s walking across a garden with 2 cups and no ceremony and no announcement and no requirement for acknowledgement. He thought about the 30 minutes that had happened in a courtyard that nobody had photographed and nobody had reported and that existed now only in the garden itself and in the memory of the 2 people who had shared it and, at one remove, in the quiet understanding of a royal guard who had been standing close enough to see but far enough away to let it be private. He did not know what the morning had meant for Catherine. He did not know what she had taken from it or how she would feel about it in a week or a month or a year. He did not know what had been said, what the specific words were, what exact territory the conversation had covered in the 30 minutes it had lasted. He knew the shape and the texture and the quality of it, the 2 currents of it, the surface and the underneath, the way the underneath had been allowed, briefly, to come up for air, and the way the surface had resumed after, lighter. He knew that something real had happened. That was all he knew. That was, he thought, standing straight in the red corridor as the clock finished marking the half-hour and the building moved forward into the business of the afternoon, that was enough to know. More than enough. More than most people who move through the visible life of an institution like this ever got to know about what actually lived inside its walls. He had been given, for 30 minutes on a gray January morning, a view through the seam of things. The gap between what the institution showed and what it actually was. He had looked through it without wanting anything from it, without planning to do anything with it, and what he had seen on the other side was not scandal or dysfunction or the secret machinery of power. What he had seen was 2 women on a bench and the human need that did not leave you just because the setting around it was extraordinary, and the human capacity to meet that need in the simplest possible way. He breathed in. He breathed out. He kept his post. Down the corridor the clock went quiet and the afternoon came on and the building continued its life the way it always did, enormous and formal and layered and ancient and, somewhere deep inside all of that, stubbornly, quietly, persistently human.